So, when it comes to the best team comps for Topaz, you obviously want to have the best combination for character because you want her to deal the most damage in the best team possible. Or maybe you want to zero Zyko with her like me. What up, Toshi here? Today we're going to go over the best teams for Topaz I believe to be towards the release of the character and going forward because this character is unlike other characters we've had as a damage dealer, being a very nice future-proof damage dealer. So first of all, the most important thing to take into consideration is one of her traces, which allows Topaz and Numby to do more damage to the enemy if they have fire weakness. Now this is going to be very important for the team compositions with Topaz and explain why Silverwolf is a very nice character to use with her in some scenarios. And then the last trace, which gives energy to Topaz whenever Numby attacks the enemy while in the Bonanza state, which is the ultimate state, right? Topaz uses the ultimate, the stock market ultimate, and then Topaz runs up the stock market sign, and then he has increased energy regeneration for Topaz after 2 hits, right? So 1 hit, 10 energy, another hit, 10 energy, and Topaz ends up getting 20 energy. Now, one last thing, Topaz's technique allows the character to get energy when the fight starts. So most of the time, as you use any damage dealer or any character that has a special passive in their talent or trace, excuse me, or the tech, I keep saying these two things. This technique, it's so weird coming from Genshin Impact when you only have talents. In this game, you have techniques. It's a little, I got to get a little more used to it. But anyways, that technique allows Topaz to get 60 energy whenever she starts the fight and Numby hits the enemy. So that means you're able to take advantage of, which I'll explain, Ting Yun in a comp with her if you want her to get her ult really, really fast and more consistently. Now, in most if not all scenarios, Asta is going to be best in slot. This is pretty much a no-brainer to everyone. She gives a ton of speed. She gives so much attack because Topaz has a low amount of attack, right? Even if attack link rope and a 5-star weapon, you still have low attack on the character is ridiculous. But Asta makes up for that by giving a ton of attack, right? It's like 80% or 80% of attack to all allies with 5 stacks, charging stacks. And since Asta can keep it up relatively easily, because just like we said before, Topaz's fire talent or trace, I keep saying talent, fire trace, which means the enemy has fire weakness, then her and Numby will do increased damage. You probably will always bring Asta in those scenarios because the fire break is very important. So you can build Asta as a damage dealer, which I probably will be building her as, or you can build her as a fire break bot, which is pretty optimal as well. And as I said before, Planetary Rendezvous, no matter what refinement you have on it, is going to be best in slot for this character with Topaz because you're going to give her a damage boost at all times and Numby included. And if you plan to use Himiko in the party as well, which we'll get into that comp a little later, then Himiko will benefit from this light cone as well. Now, Cogs is a very solid choice, but do keep in mind that this means that you're only just going to benefit from the speed increase, but you're not going to get the damage from Planetary Rendezvous. Planetary Rendezvous, in my experience, is much better than this. It's really good. Like, meshing Cogs is amazing on a character like Ting Yun because Ting Yun gives direct energy to the ally with her ultimate. So getting energy to that character is much more important. But Asta doesn't really need meshing Cogs, especially if the enemy has fire weakness, in my honest opinion. So if the enemy is already weak to fire and you're so you'll take value of having Himiko and Topaz in the party. Almost said Asta. I mean, yeah, Asta too. But Topaz and Himiko benefiting from the follow-up attack buff or debuff that Topaz puts on the boss enemy, and then Himiko having her own follow-up in her attack to be able to boost up the action forward of Numby. But again, this team, very good in scenarios, in blast scenarios, when the enemy is already weak to fire. Now, before we do get into team comps, there's one thing I want to mention. Think of using Topaz like you would use Kafka, right? Whenever there is an enemy that is weak to a specific element, you would bring that elemental coverage with Kafka in order to take advantage of the elemental system in this game, right? Now, just like Kafka I said, Topaz, depending on who the enemy is or the element the enemy is weak to, the enemy is already weak to fire, then of course bring Himiko. If the enemy is not weak to fire, then bring either Silverwolf if you're in single target scenarios, or bring another character that the enemy is weak to, like Lightning, bring Jing. If you have Jing, if the enemy is weak to physical, bring Car. Bling. What the fuck is a bling? Man, shut up. So this team comp, you can use Kafka or Jing. They pretty much work the same way. Now, of course, Jing does benefit more from the follow attack debuff that Topaz has placed on the enemy. Obviously, no one's going to deny that. But Kafka is still a very nice character to use because she has a very consistent follow-up attack that will push up the action forward of Numby, making sure Numby gets those extra hits in. So I like this team comp a lot. I will be using this team comp with Topaz whenever the enemy is weak to lightning, because I already don't have a character like Jing. Now, one more thing to take into consideration, because if you are using this team whenever the enemy is weak to fire or weak to lightning, let's just say fire in this scenario, right? Asta will break the enemy. If you have it with a break effect build, then Asta will potentially give a nice break effect dot on the enemy, and Kafka can then go and proc that break effect dot, dealing more damage. So it really depends on how you have your Asta built. In this scenario, I would build Asta as a break effect character. Now, it is more optimal to build Asta as a break effect character in all scenarios, just because it's a lot easier to get break effect than it is to get crit stats. So that's one thing taken into consideration. And of course, the last slot will be a sustained character. It doesn't matter who you bring. You can bring any sustained character. I don't have very many, so I'd bring Natasha, for instance. She's really good here. But if you don't have Natasha, then you can bring March 7th is actually really solid. The reason I say that is because of her freeze and the fact that Kafka benefits from the enemy being frozen anyways with her built-in dot, right? So this is a solid team comp you can use. So this team is going to be whenever the enemy is not weak against fire, and you need to put that fire weakness on the enemy so Topaz benefits from her trace, you'd bring Silverwolf in this party. Now keep in mind, this is very good in single target scenarios, mostly only single target scenarios. I wouldn't bring this anywhere else because Silverwolf does fall off if you're not bringing her in single target scenarios, right? In AoE scenarios, she is kind of mid. Blast is really good with her though. If you're using Seal specifically, but any other damage dealer in Blast scenarios with Silverwolf kind of feels meh, especially Topaz, because you want the AoE coverage instead of having this. Now, I will say one thing taken into consideration: if you are planning to use this team, and let's say the enemy is already weak to fire, you actually don't have to bring Silverwolf, because instead you can bring Ting Yun, and Ting Yun will give energy to Topaz and make sure that Topaz gets her ult constantly. So there's going to be a very solid hyper carry team in those single target scenarios. I will use this team a lot when the enemy is already weak to fire in those single target scenarios. And of course, sustained character here, but if you are using Silverwolf, let's just go back to that. If you are using Silverwolf, make sure you have a quantum character in this last slot, just so you can ensure you put that elemental weakness on the enemy, right? And then of course, Topaz can use quantum set in this team comp. That's another thing to take into consideration, but only with Silverwolf, right? Only with Silverwolf. Now, as I said before, you obviously want to match the elements the enemy is weak to. So if the enemy is weak to physical, then you'll benefit from having Clara in the scenario, right? And this is going to be for Blast and single target too. Single target, she can still be pretty good, right? It's just that she will get less counterattacks consistently because there's not enough enemies to make sure that she will at least be hit by one of them, right? So you can still use Clara in single target scenarios, but do keep in mind that it does drop off the damage because there's not enough enemies to constantly hit Clara. Now, in this team comp, if you are using Clara, you can use Lynx, and Lynx will increase the aggro of Clara, which is very nice, and then Topaz benefiting from all of that in this team comp. Now, do I need to say more? I mean, we know how this team is going to work. This is probably the team most people are going to use in all scenarios, right? But I would mostly use this if the enemy is weak to physical, right? If the enemy's not weak to physical, then Clara's damage does fall off quite a bit. That's with any damage deal in this game. If the enemy is not weak to said element, that damage does fall off. And Baby 209 just does so much damage, it doesn't matter where you bring him. He's a different character, right? Jing Lu kind of, but Jing Lu really does want to use Pela, which means that you want to use her in scenarios when the enemy is weak to ice. But again, Denhang is just a special case. He's just a really broken character. So this is going to be the Whale Bronya. If you have Bronya with Eidolon 4 and Eidolon 6 especially, whenever the enemy is weak to wind with how Bronya works, then Bronya will deal a follow-up attack to the enemy whenever an ally hits that enemy with a basic attack, right? So this means whenever you are using her in the scenarios where the boss enemy is weak to wind and that enemy has the debuff, right, the proof of depth debuff that Topaz puts on the enemy, you're going to love using her because she will push up the action forward of Numby. And with Eidolon 6, the damage buff she gives with her elemental skill will last for 2 turns. So that means Numby will take advantage of this buff. This is also really good for Jing too. Now, one thing to take into consideration, the second ally you bring in here, because with Bronya, you're always going to have a hyper carry comp. It doesn't matter where you use her. Bronya is a character that fuels hyper carry compositions. You're going to have to use another character that fuels that composition as well. So there is a few options that comes to mind. Okay, so before I do not have Clara, but pretend this is Clara, right? Physical element, pretend this is Clara. Clara can be a very solid character to use still with Topaz because all the buffs Bronya provides with her ultimate, well, Clara will be getting no matter what turn it is because it is dependent on the allies' turns. And since Clara is a slow character, right? 90 base speed. You're going to love the buffs that Bronya gives because that means Clara will have those buffs longer than Topaz would, right? Because Bronya will keep pushing up the action forward of Topaz. Ting Yun being very good if the enemy is already weak to fire. So that means Ting Yun will give the energy to Topaz. This is a very solid hypercarry comp you probably already use with Seal and other damage dealers, right? Well, this is going to be really solid for Topaz because the damage buff she gives for Numbi in her ultimate will be having a lot more uptime. And since she naturally takes more turns with Bronya giving action forward, well, she's going to have her ultimate really, really fast. So this is going to be her best team bar none if the enemy is weak to fire already. Now, if the enemy is not weak to fire, then bring Silverwolf. This will be very good in single target scenarios because Silverwolf being able to give. I mean, I think we all usually forget what she does because she does so much. Or maybe you don't forget because I constantly remind you all of what Silverwolf does because I talk about this character in like every single video because she's so broken, right? She gives a weakness, the fire weakness to the enemy, but she gives a resist reduction on the enemy as well, which is 10% at max level, and then a further 20% because that fire weakness on the enemy means the enemy will be weak to fire then. So that is 30% resist reduction that she throws on the enemy. And then a massive defense shred that goes up to 45% at level 10 is very, very strong to have on Silverwolf because this means that the enemy will take extreme amounts of damage because enemies at higher levels usually have high base defense. She gives a further 8% at max levels defense shred, which again is very good whenever you're using her in those single target scenarios. And then she gives an additional 3% resist reduction on the enemy to further increase the damage of Topaz. And that defense shred is going to have 100% uptime because it lasts 3 turns. And if you use her event 5-star Lycone, it is essentially a 5-star Lycone because of how strong it is, you'll always have the ultimate defense down on the enemy, all times. And all of that is without even using an energy regeneration rate rope. So, Silverwolf is going to be extremely strong with Topaz, especially because that trace, allowing Topaz to deal more damage from Numbi if the enemy is weak to fire. But that's going to be the end of the discussion with this because I keep talking about it, right? Now, this is going to be another team that I would find myself using in blast scenarios, believe it or not, or even scenarios, AoE scenarios, where you want to use Topaz because you just love using the character. Well, if the enemy is already weak to ice, and let's say the enemy is also weak to fire, which is pretty rare, but it is possible, then you would probably be able to get away with using this team because Pela providing the AoE defense shred means that even the boss will have the defense shred, so the one enemy Topaz will be hitting, well, that enemy will have his defense down, and then Herda will be able to deal a ton of damage because she does excel at AoE scenarios where the enemy is weak to ice. Now, with that being said, whenever the enemies do fall below 50%, and considering, well, if she misses a crit, this is going to be in your best interest. If she misses a crit on one of the enemies, right, then the enemy will not be below that 50 or at 50 or lower HP threshold in order to get the crew follow-up attack, where then the enemy will then take that damage, and then she will push up the action for the Numbi. So it is in your best interest to have her around like maybe 80% crit rate and hope that she misses crit on one of the enemies, right? But still, this is going to be a very solid team, believe it or not, if the enemy is weak to ice and fire. But only in that scenario, right? And it has to be AoE, of course. So there you have it. I wanted to make this video because I've seen a lot of people asking, what characters should I use with Topaz? And to me, she's just like Kafka, right? So she works as a character where you can have her as a main damage dealer, or you can have her as a sub DPS enabler, right? Just like Kafka, for instance. Now, Kafka is not a sub DPS, but she is a dot enabler. So, whenever we get more follow-up attack characters, right? Maybe a follow-up attack character of the imaginary element, then whenever the enemy is weak to that imaginary element, then you can bring that character in slot of whoever the ally you're bringing the enemy was not weak to originally, right? So think of this as a character that has a different playstyle from other characters in the game, but is future-proof like Kafka in the sense of her having value long-term because she is a very nice supporter for allies that deal follow-up attack damage on the enemy. That's going to be the video here. Hopefully you got something out of this, and I will see you all at the release of Topaz. Peace.